The invitation of fate. Sophia Winters absently brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, leaving a smudge of soil on her cheek. The university greenhouse was her sanctuary, a place where the world made sense amid rows of carefully labeled specimens and the earthy perfume of growing things. At 32, she had built her life around her botanical research, specializing in rare medicinal plants that might hold cures for degenerative diseases. "Dr. Winters, you've got mail," called Priya, her graduate assistant, waving an elegant cream envelope like a flag. "Looks fancy. Maybe you've won something." Sophia wiped her hands on her worn lab coat and took the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, nothing like the grant rejections that usually filled her mailbox. She broke the gold seal and pulled out a card, embossed with flowing script. "The Vienna Institute of Scientific Innovation cordially invites you to present your research on adaptive properties of tropical medicinal flora at our annual funding gala." "That's impossible," Sophia whispered. The Vienna Institute was legendary, a gathering of the world's most prestigious scientists and wealthiest benefactors. People waited decades for such invitations. "What is it?" Priya peered over her shoulder, then gasped. "The Vienna Gala. Dr. Winters, that's amazing. Your work is finally getting the recognition it deserves." Sophia shook her head. "There must be a mistake. My research is important, but it's not flashy. The Institute usually showcases projects with immediate commercial applications." "Well, someone there disagrees," Priya replied. "This could fund your research for years." Later that night, Sophia sat in her modest apartment, surrounded by journals and potted specimens, staring at the invitation. Her research on a particular Amazonian orchid showed promise for treating neurodegenerative disorders, but she needed resources for further studies, resources that had been consistently denied by conventional funding sources. One week she murmured to the orchid on her windowsill, "Can I even afford to go to Vienna for a week?" Her finances were as carefully managed as her experiments, with little room for extra. The flight alone would strain her credit card to its limit, and what would she wear to an event attended by Nobel laureates and billionaires? She thought of declining, of staying safely in her greenhouse where she belonged. Then her phone chimed with an email notification. "Dr. Winters," it read, "we are pleased to inform you that your travel expenses to Vienna will be covered by an anonymous benefactor who has expressed interest in your research." Sophia stared at the screen. Who would sponsor an unknown botanist's trip to Vienna? The coincidence felt almost orchestrated, as if some invisible hand was guiding her toward this opportunity. In the following days, Sophia prepared her presentation with meticulous care. Each slide was a labor of love, showcasing years of research in the most compelling way possible. If she had only one chance to secure funding, she would make it count. The night before her departure, she pulled out the one formal dress she owned, a simple emerald gown she'd worn to a doctoral graduation 3 years ago. It wasn't designer, but its color complemented her eyes and brought out the copper highlights in her hair. It would have to do as her plane descended into Vienna. Sophia gazed out the window at the imperial city below. The Baroque architecture and manicured gardens were a world away from her university greenhouse. For the first time, doubt crept in. What did she, with her dirt-stained fingernails and practical research, have to offer a gathering of the elite? Her hotel, arranged by the Institute, was far more luxurious than anywhere she had ever stayed. The concierge handed her an itinerary for the week, culminating in the grand gala where selected scientists would present to potential investors. "The car will collect you at 7 tomorrow evening for the welcome reception, Dr. Winters," he informed her with practiced politeness. That night, Sophia rehearsed her presentation one final time, speaking passionately to her reflection about the potential of her orchids to transform neurological medicine. Science was her language, her truth. If she could just make them understand the importance of her work, perhaps the rest, her simple dress, her lack of connections, wouldn't matter. As she finally drifted to sleep, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous awaited her in Vienna, something that would change the course of her carefully planned life. What she didn't know was that across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the Danube, Julian Blackwood was reviewing the list of presenting scientists with particular interest in a botanist whose passion had somehow reached him through the cold data of her research papers. Asterisk. Whispers among orchids. The Vienna Institute's welcome reception unfolded in the Baroque splendor of a former imperial palace. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, illuminating the scientific elite as they mingled with potential investors. Sophia stood at the entrance, clutching her small evening bag like a lifeline. Her emerald dress, while elegant in the mirror of her modest apartment, now seemed painfully understated among a sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos. "Dr. Winters, welcome." A young woman with a tablet approached her. "I'm Amelia, your liaison for the week. Your presentation on medicinal flora is scheduled for Thursday afternoon in the Botanical Innovation session." "Thank you," Sophia replied, grateful for the direction. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone here." Amelia smiled sympathetically. "The networking can be intimidating, but it's essential. Let me introduce you to some people who might be interested in your research." As they navigated through clusters of conversation, Sophia couldn't help noticing the subtle hierarchy at play. Established scientists with prestigious affiliations were courted by investors, while lesser-known researchers like herself seemed to orbit the periphery, hoping for a chance encounter that might change their fortunes. Dr. Harrington is presenting quantum computing solutions, Amelia whispered, nodding toward a distinguished man surrounded by admirers. And over there is Dr. Wellington with her nanomedicine startup, already valued at $500 million. Sophia nodded, trying to suppress the feeling that she was an imposter among giants. When Amelia was called away to assist another guest, Sophia found herself alone beside an elaborate display of rare orchids of familiar comfort in unfamiliar territory. Phalaenopsis amabilis, she murmured, gently touching the petal of a moon orchid. But you're not thriving here, are you? Too much direct light. Most people admire their beauty without noticing their distress. A deep voice observed from behind her. Sophia turned to find herself facing a tall man in an impeccably tailored black suit. His features were striking rather than conventionally handsome, sharp cheekbones, intense gray eyes, and dark hair with distinguished silver at the temples despite appearing only in his early 40s. Something about his gaze suggested he saw more than others, penetrating surfaces to the truths beneath. Julian Blackwood, he introduced himself with minimal ceremony, extending his hand. The name registered immediately. Julian Blackwood was a near-mythical figure in the tech world, a brilliant programmer who had built a cybersecurity empire before abruptly stepping back from public life 3 years ago. His rare appearances at events like this were noteworthy enough to generate headlines. Sophia Winters, she replied, surprised by the firmness of her voice as she shook his hand. I'm a botanical researcher from Pacific Northwest University. I know, he said simply, his gaze steady. Your work on neurogenerative properties of the Amazonian dracontium is remarkable. Sophia blinked in surprise. You've read my papers. All of them. Julian turned his attention to the orchid display. You noticed what the event planners missed. These orchids need diffused light. Details matter, especially when they reveal the difference between appearance and reality. Before Sophia could respond, they were interrupted by a woman in a dazzling silver gown. Julian, darling, the Minister of Science has been looking everywhere for you. He nodded politely but without warmth. Eleanor, I'll find him shortly. Eleanor's gaze slid to Sophia, assessing her simple dress with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. And who is your friend? Dr. Sophia Winters, Julian replied, a subtle edge to his tone. She's pioneering research that could transform treatment for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Eleanor's expression shifted to one of practiced interests. How fascinating. Well, don't keep the minister waiting too long, Julian. With a meaningful glance, she glided back into the crowd. That was Eleanor Huntington, Julian explained, pharmaceutical heiress and institute board member, useful to have on your side. Sophia felt a familiar unease. I'm not very good at these games, cultivating the right people, saying the right things. Then we have something in common, Julian said, the corner of his mouth lifting in what might have been a smile. I find most social obligations tedious. People speaking without saying anything of substance. A waiter passed with champagne, and Julian secured 2 glasses, handing one to Sophia. Too substance over style, he said, raising his glass slightly. As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself in conversation with Julian about her research-real conversation, not the simplified explanations she usually offered at social functions. He asked insightful questions that revealed a genuine understanding of botanical science, unexpected in someone from the tech world. Why orchids? He asked as they stood apart from the main crowd. What drew you to them specifically? Sophia considered the question. They're survivors, she finally said. Orchids adapt to some of the most hostile environments on Earth, evolving mechanisms that allow them to thrive where other plants can't. And in those adaptations, they've developed compounds with remarkable properties, compounds that might help human brains recover from damage we've always considered irreversible. Julian nodded, something shifting in his expression. Adaptation as a pathway to healing. There's profound truth in that. A subtle commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of protesters had gathered outside, their signs visible through the grand windows. Science for people, not profit, and medical access for all. The annual demonstration, Julian noted. They believe the Institute prioritizes profitable innovations over humanitarian needs. Don't they have a point? Sophia asked before she could stop herself. Instead of taking offense, Julian studied her with renewed interest. Many here would consider that question impolitic. I suppose I'm not very political, she admitted, but I've seen promising research abandoned because the potential market wasn't lucrative enough. My own work, she stopped herself, suddenly aware she might be jeopardizing her funding chances. Your work deserves support, regardless of market size, Julian finished for her. The value of healing cannot be measured only in profit margins. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Institute's director, announcing dinner. As guests began moving toward the dining hall, Julian leaned closer to Sophia. The table assignments are strategic, designed to pair scientists with compatible investors, he said quietly. I've taken the liberty of adjusting them. You'll find yourself seated with people who might actually appreciate your work. Before she could thank him, he was gone, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. At dinner, Sophia found herself placed between the director of neurological research at a major hospital and a venture capitalist known for funding early-stage medical innovations. By the meal's end, both had requested private demonstrations of her research. As Sophia returned to her hotel that night, her mind was filled with conflicting impressions: the calculated nature of the event, the unexpected interest in her work, and most of all, the enigmatic Julian Blackwood, who seemed to operate by his own rules in a world of rigid expectations. What she couldn't know was that in his private office across the city, Julian was reviewing everything ever published about her research, driven by a personal interest he had revealed to no one. The Garden Between Worlds, the third day of the Vienna Institute conference, dawned with soft rain pattering against Sophia's hotel window. She had spent the previous day attending presentations and panels, quietly observing the delicate dance of science and capitalism. Today, however, held something unexpected. An invitation had been delivered to her room that morning, requesting her presence at the Institute's private botanical garden for further discussion of research possibilities. The card was unmarked, except for a time and an address, but the expensive stationery and precise wording suggested Julian Blackwood's involvement. Sophia hesitated, running her fingers along the embossed edge. She had come to Vienna for funding opportunities, not mysterious meetings with enigmatic billionaires, and yet, something about Julian's genuine interest in her work had resonated with her in a way the practiced enthusiasm of other potential investors had not. The botanical garden was housed in an elegant glass structure reminiscent of Victorian nestled behind the Institute's main building. When Sophia arrived, the rain had subsided to a gentle mist that clung to her hair and coat. She was surprised to find the garden empty of other visitors. The only sound, the gentle drip of water from leaves and the distant hum of climate control systems. Dr. Winters. Julian's voice came from among a collection of rare tropical specimens. He stood beside a particularly vibrant bromeliad, dressed more casually than at the reception in dark trousers and a charcoal sweater that somehow emphasized rather than diminished his authoritative presence. "Thank you for coming. This place is extraordinary," Sophia said, removing her rain-spotted jacket. "I've read about the Institute's collection, but experiencing it firsthand, I thought you might appreciate it." Julian gestured toward a path winding deeper into the greenhouse. "There's something specific I wanted to show you." As they walked, Sophia noticed that the garden's design mimicked natural ecosystems rather than displaying plants in sterile, taxonomic rows. Epiphytes clung to carefully preserved tree trunks, while ground cover species created a living tapestry below. It was a scientific collection that honored the interconnectedness of its subjects, a rarity in institutional settings. "You've been asking questions about my research," Sophia observed, matching his unhurried pace. "But I know very little about you, beyond what appears in the press." Julian's mouth curved slightly. "The press rarely captures reality. They prefer narratives: the reclusive genius, the ruthless businessman, the eccentric philanthropist, simpler than acknowledging human complexity." "Which narrative is closest to the truth?" Sophia asked. "Perhaps all and none," he replied. "I built my company on understanding systems, how they function, where they're vulnerable. Eventually, I realized I understood the systems better than the people operating within them." They reached a small clearing containing a single glass enclosure. Inside was an orchid. Sophia recognized immediately Dracontium amazonense, the very species central to her research. "This is," she began, stepping closer to the enclosure. "Your orchid," Julian finished. "Not precisely the same cultivar you work with, but close. The Institute acquired it 6 months ago from a Brazilian conservation program." Sophia examined the plant with professional admiration. "It's thriving. Perfect humidity. Ideal light exposure." She glanced up at him with sudden understanding. "You arranged for this to be here." "I did," he acknowledged. "After reading your research, I wanted to see the subject of your devotion for myself." "Why?" The directness of her question surprised even her. Julian was silent for a moment, studying the orchid rather than meeting her gaze. 3 years ago, my sister was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's," he finally said, his voice level but with an undercurrent of controlled pain. "Emma was 36, brilliant, a concert pianist. We watched as her memory fragmented, first forgetting small things, then entire sonatas she'd performed for decades. And finally, on bad days, my name." Sophia felt a tightening in her chest. "I'm so sorry. The conventional treatments offered minimal help and devastating side effects," he continued. "I redirected significant resources toward finding alternatives, experimental treatments, clinical trials, anything that showed promise. Your research caught my attention because it approached the problem from an entirely different angle. The compounds from the orchid aren't a cure," Sophia said gently. "My preliminary results suggest they may slow progression, possibly repair some damaged neural pathways. But they offer something current treatments don't," Julian finished. "Hope based on rigorous science rather than desperate wishes." The revelation of his personal stake transformed Sophia's understanding of their interaction. "You're my anonymous benefactor," she realized. "The one who arranged my invitation, covered my expenses, Julian nodded once, unapologetic. The Institute's selection committee initially passed over your proposal. They prioritized market potential over scientific merit. I persuaded them to reconsider. Through financial incentive, Sophia guessed. Through whatever means necessary, he corrected. The scientific community's fixation on marketable innovations over transformative discoveries is short. Some advances transcend immediate profit considerations. They continued walking, passing through sections dedicated to medicinal plants from different regions of the world. The garden created a strange liminal space, neither fully natural nor artificial, a carefully constructed ecosystem that acknowledged human intervention while respecting botanical integrity. My sister is participating in a clinical trial in Switzerland, Julian said after a comfortable silence. The results are modest but encouraging. Her decline has slowed, and on good days she can still play portions of her favorite concertos. Music engages multiple brain regions, Sophia noted. It creates neural pathways that sometimes remain accessible even when others deteriorate. Like your orchids finding ways to thrive in seemingly inhospitable environments, Julian observed. Exactly. Sophia stopped beside a small pool where aquatic plants floated on the surface. Adaptation isn't just about survival, it's about finding unexpected ways to flourish despite constraints. As they reached the center of the garden, they found a small glass-enclosed pavilion surrounded by flowering vines. Inside, a table had been set with tea and a modest lunch. Through the glass walls, the entire garden was visible from this central vantage point. I thought we might continue our conversation here, Julian said, opening the door for her. Over lunch, their discussion ranged from scientific specifics to broader philosophical questions. Julian revealed himself to be not just a technical genius but a thoughtful observer of human systems and their failures. Sophia found herself speaking more openly than she had with colleagues, sharing both her scientific ambitions and her frustrations with academic politics that had repeatedly sidelined her research. The university administration sees my work as a distraction from more commercially viable projects, she admitted, cradling a cup of fragrant tea. Last year, they reduced my lab space and redirected my graduate assistants to a project developing cosmetic applications for botanical extracts. Because beauty products offer faster returns than treating neurodegenerative diseases, Julian observed with barely concealed contempt. I understand the financial realities, Sophia said. Universities need to fund themselves. But when those pressures compromise scientific exploration, they shouldn't have to compromise, Julian interrupted. What if you had the resources to pursue your research without institutional constraints, private funding, dedicated facilities, the freedom to follow the science wherever it leads? Sophia set down her cup. That's every researcher's dream, but few achieve it. I'm proposing to make it your reality, Julian said, his gray eyes intent. Not just funding for a single project, but a sustainable research program built around your work. The offer was so far beyond what Sophia had hoped for that she couldn't immediately process it. Why would you invest so much in unproven research? Is it truly about investment, or is it about my sister? Julian asked, seeming to genuinely consider the question himself. Perhaps both. I've built a fortune on calculated risks with significant potential returns. Your research represents both the most personal and potentially the most meaningful risk I've ever considered taking. As afternoon light filtered through the glass ceiling, casting prism patterns across the table between them, Sophia realized they occupied a space between their respective worlds. Neither the cutthroat environment of high-stakes business nor the rigidly hierarchical academic sphere, but something new, a garden of possibility between worlds, where different values and approaches might cross-pollinate and thrive. I need time to consider what this would mean, she said finally, for my research, my career, my independence as a scientist. Julian nodded, respecting her caution. Of course, the gala isn't until tomorrow night. Perhaps by then, you'll have decided whether we might build something meaningful together. As they left the botanical garden, returning to the busy world of the conference, neither of them noticed Eleanor Huntington watching their exit from a second-floor window, her expression calculating as she made a phone call. Thomas, it's Eleanor. I believe we may have a problem with the Blackwood situation. He's showing interest in alternative researcher, botanist with a potentially competing approach to our Alzheimer's drug pipeline. I think it's time we implemented our contingency plan. Asterisk storms and shelter. The morning of the gala dawned with an unexpected thunderstorm that mirrored the turbulence in Sophia's mind. She had spent much of the night weighing Julian's extraordinary offer against her ingrained caution. The prospect of unlimited research funding without the constraints of university politics was tantalizing, but she couldn't ignore the potential complications of becoming so deeply connected to a single benefactor, particularly one with a personal stake in her outcomes. Her contemplation was interrupted by an urgent knock at her hotel room door. Amelia stood in the hallway, her usual professional composure visibly strained. Dr. Winters, there's been a development regarding your presentation this evening, she said, stepping inside and closing the door. The committee has ... concerns. Concerns? About what? Sophia asked, her stomach tightening. Amelia handed her a tablet displaying a scientific journal's website. The featured article headline read, "Ethical Questions Surround Amazonian Orchid Research, Exploitation of Indigenous Knowledge Without Attribution." This was published online an hour ago, Amelia explained. It alleges that your research builds on traditional medicine practices without proper acknowledgement or compensation to indigenous communities. Sophia scanned the article, her hands growing cold. This is absurd. My research acknowledges the ethnobotanical origins of these applications. I've collaborated with indigenous researchers and followed all ethical guidelines for benefit sharing. The committee is concerned about the Institute's reputation, Amelia said apologetically. They're meeting now to decide whether to proceed with your presentation. As Amelia left, Sophia's phone chimed with a series of notifications, colleagues asking about the allegations, a message from her department chair requesting an urgent call, and most alarmingly, an email from the University Ethics Committee announcing a formal review. Sophia sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the room suddenly spinning around her. Years of meticulous work, her scientific reputation, her career prospects all threatened by allegations that felt precisely targeted to undermine her at this crucial moment. Her phone rang again. Julian's name appeared on the screen. "I've seen the article," he said without preamble when she answered. "This isn't coincidence, Sophia. It's sabotage." "Why would anyone bother sabotaging me?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I'm hardly a threat to established interests." "You weren't," Julian corrected, "until I showed interest in funding your research at scale. Meet me in the lobby in 15 minutes. When Sophia arrived downstairs, Julian was waiting in a secluded corner, his expression grim. "Eleanor Huntington sits on the board of Neurotech Pharmaceuticals," he said without preamble. "They have an Alzheimer's drug in final clinical trials, one that would be threatened by a natural alternative with fewer side effects." "You think she orchestrated this?" Sophia asked, the pieces falling into place. "I know she did," Julian replied. "My security team has traced the article to a science journalist who regularly receives consulting fees from Neurotech's PR firm." Sophia felt a surge of anger replacing her initial shock. Even if that's true, the damage is done. The committee won't risk the controversy. "Then we bypass the committee," Julian said with calm determination. "The purpose of this event is to connect innovation with resources. We don't need their stage to accomplish that." Within hours, Julian had secured a private meeting room at the hotel and invited key neurological researchers and independent investors, people interested in the science rather than the politics. Sophia worked frantically to prepare a defense of her ethical practices alongside her presentation materials, documenting her collaborations with indigenous researchers and benefit-sharing agreements. As evening approached, Sophia dressed for the gala in her emerald gown, her presentation materials prepared but her participation now uncertain. Her phone rang again. The committee chairperson, Dr. Winters, after reviewing the situation, "We've decided to postpone your presentation pending further investigation." The chair informed her, professional regret in his voice. "You're still welcome to attend the gala, of course." "Of course," Sophia echoed hollowly. "Heaven forbid you lose a ticket sale." She ended the call and stared at her reflection, seeing not defeat but determination hardening in her eyes. She had spent her career fighting for recognition of her work's value. This was merely another battle in that ongoing war. At the gala, Sophia entered with her head held high despite the whispers that followed her through the crowd. She spotted Eleanor Huntington holding court among a circle of admirers, satisfaction evident in her smile. "Quite the dramatic turn of events," Eleanor said as Sophia approached. "Such a shame when ethical oversights derail promising research. Interesting that you consider proper attribution and oversight rather than standard scientific practice." Sophia replied evenly. "Almost as interesting as Neurotech's history of opposing competition through manufactured controversies." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but perhaps focusing on defending your work would be more productive than making accusations." "I agree completely." Julian's voice came from behind them. He stood with several distinguished guests, including the Minister of Science and 2 Nobel laureates, which is why Dr. Winters will be presenting her research and addressing these allegations directly in meeting room A in 15 minutes. "I've taken the liberty of inviting those genuinely interested in scientific advancement rather than market protection." Eleanor's composure visibly cracked. "This is highly irregular. Julian, the committee has made its decision." The committee made a decision based on incomplete information and external pressure, Julian countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Those who care about scientific integrity rather than corporate interests are welcome to hear the full story." As Julian guided Sophia away, Eleanor called after them. "You're making a serious mistake, Julian. There are processes for a reason." "Yes," he replied without turning back, "and there are workarounds for when those processes fail." In the meeting room, Sophia presented to a smaller but more engaged audience than she would have had at the official event. She methodically addressed the allegations, presenting documentation of her collaboration with indigenous researchers, proper attribution in her papers, and the benefit-sharing agreements she had established. "The compounds derived from these orchids represent hope for millions suffering from neurodegenerative diseases," she concluded. This research honors traditional knowledge while advancing it through modern scientific methods. The attempt to discredit this work through false allegations does a disservice not only to science but to patients awaiting better treatments. As questions came from the assembled researchers and investors, Sophia felt her confidence rebuilding. These were people who understood both the scientific and ethical dimensions of her work, who recognized the patterns of corporate interference in threatening research. Later that evening, as the main gala continued without them, Sophia and Julian stood on the hotel's rooftop terrace. The lights of Vienna spread before them like earthbound stars. 6 investors have already expressed interest in supporting your research, Julian said, handing her a glass of champagne. Eleanor miscalculated. Her attack only highlighted the importance of your work and the lengths pharmaceutical companies will go to protect their market interests. What happens now? Sophia asked, gazing out at the city. That depends on you, Julian replied. You could return to your university with new funding and continue your work there, though I suspect the ethics investigation will create obstacles, or I could accept your offer, Sophia finished. A dedicated research institute with independent oversight, Julian nodded. With complete scientific autonomy for you. I provide resources and infrastructure. You'll determine the research direction. No corporate interference, no academic politics, just science in service of healing. Sophia considered how quickly her world had transformed from the quiet certainty of her greenhouse to this precipice of possibility. And your sister, what role does she play in this vision? Emma would be a patient like any other, Julian said quietly. Perhaps with access to experimental treatments if appropriate, but never at the expense of scientific integrity. I want to help her. But I recognize that meaningful advances require methodical research, not shortcuts. In that moment, as lightning flashed over distant hills, Sophia recognized that storms sometimes cleared paths that would otherwise remain hidden. The attack on her work had revealed both unexpected allies and the true nature of the systems she operated within. Perhaps it was time to build something new, a shelter against such storms for herself and for science itself. Blooming beyond boundaries 1 year later. The Winters Institute for Botanical Neuroscience opened its doors on the outskirts of Vienna, a striking complex of glass and sustainable materials that housed state-of-the-art laboratories, cultivation facilities, and research spaces. The central building featured a massive greenhouse dome visible from the surrounding countryside, a monument to transparency in both architecture and scientific practice. Sophia stood at the entrance, greeting researchers who had come from around the world to join her team. Some were established scientists frustrated by corporate constraints on their work. Others were brilliant newcomers whose unconventional approaches had found little support in traditional institutions. Together they represented a new model of scientific collaboration, one that honored diverse knowledge traditions while maintaining rigorous methodological standards. Dr. Winters, the indigenous delegation has arrived, announced Tomas, her administrative director. They're being shown to the conference room for the knowledge-sharing agreement signing. This was perhaps the aspect of the institute that gave Sophia the most pride, its formal collaboration with indigenous communities, whose botanical knowledge had informed her research. Representatives from 3 Amazonian communities would participate in a groundbreaking agreement that ensured not just attribution and compensation, but ongoing participation in research directions and benefit distribution. As Sophia made her way to the conference room, she passed the memorial wall where photographs of patients with neurodegenerative diseases reminded everyone of the human stakes behind their scientific pursuits. Among them was a picture of Emma Blackwood at her piano, her fingers poised over the keys, her expression one of complete absorption in the music. Emma had become more than just Julian's sister to Sophia over the past year. As one of the first participants in their expanded clinical trials, she had shown modest but meaningful improvements under their experimental treatment protocol. More importantly, she had become a friend. Someone whose perspective as a patient informed the Institute's approach to balancing scientific rigor with compassionate application. The signing ceremony completed, Sophia found herself with an unexpected, the free hour before the Institute's official opening reception. She made her way to her personal greenhouse, smaller than the main research facilities but designed specifically for the orchid species central to her work. I thought I might find you here, Julian said, appearing in the doorway. He looked different than he had a year ago, still formidable, but with subtle signs of someone who had found a different kind of purpose. Hiding from your own celebration. Not hiding, Sophia corrected, adjusting the misting system for a row of seedlings. Centering. Everything we've built started with these plants. Julian moved to stand beside her, examining the orchids with appreciation rather than the clinical assessment he might once have brought to any evaluation. The Institute has already accomplished what many thought impossible. 3 pharmaceutical companies have approached about collaboration rather than competition. The WHO has expressed interest in our equitable access models. And Eleanor Huntington sends her congratulations, Sophia added with a wry smile, referring to the card that had arrived that morning, a gesture of reconciliation after Neurotech's board had removed Eleanor following the exposure of her tactics against competing research. Politicians and corporate leaders adapt when the prevailing winds change, Julian observed. What matters is that we've created something that can weather whatever storms come next. As they walked together through the greenhouse, Sophia reflected on their unlikely partnership, what had begun as a calculated intervention on Julian's part, an attempt to advance research that might help his sister, had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. They had built not just a research institute but a new model for how science could operate when freed from certain constraints while voluntarily embracing others. The Board of Ethics meets next week to review our first round of human trials, Sophia said, referring to the independent oversight committee they had established, one of several accountability measures that distinguished the institute. The preliminary data is promising. Emma played an entire Chopin nocturne yesterday, Julian said quietly from memory. It was the first time in 3 years Sophia felt the weight of that achievement, not just as a researcher but as someone who had come to care deeply about both the Blackwood siblings. One patient doesn't constitute scientific proof, she cautioned gently. No, Julian agreed, but it constitutes hope. Sometimes that's enough to sustain us through the longer scientific journey. As they exited the greenhouse and walked toward the main complex where guests were beginning to arrive for the opening reception, Sophia paused to look back at what they had created. Not just the physical buildings but the community of purpose that inhabited them. When I entered that gala in Vienna wearing my simple dress, I never imagined this outcome, she admitted. I was hoping for a modest grant, perhaps some networking opportunities, and I was looking for a scientific solution to a personal problem, Julian added. Instead, we found something more valuable, a way to transform not just treatments but how science itself operates. The evening sun caught the glass dome of the main greenhouse, transforming it into a beacon visible for miles, a fitting symbol for an institution dedicated to illuminating new pathways for healing and knowledge. Inside, researchers from diverse backgrounds and traditions prepared to share their work, united by respect for both scientific methodology and human dignity. As they entered the reception, Sophia was struck by how different this gathering was from the Vienna Gala where their paths had first crossed. Here, substance truly did take precedence over style, with genuine collaboration replacing strategic networking. Researchers engaged with investors as equals rather than supplicants, while patients and community representatives participated as valued stakeholders rather than abstract beneficiaries. Emma Blackwood sat at a grand piano in the corner, playing softly, her technique still impaired but her musical expression intact. When she saw Sophia and Julian, she smiled and shifted into a piece she had composed for the occasion, aptly titled Unexpected Blooming. Later, as Sophia addressed the gathered community, she looked out at the faces before her: scientists and patients, investors and indigenous knowledge keepers, all part of an ecosystem as complex and interdependent as any found in nature. What we've created here transcends any single research breakthrough, she said. We've demonstrated that when we recognize the value of different knowledge traditions, when we prioritize healing over profit margins, when we create systems that honor both scientific rigor and human dignity, we can achieve what once seemed impossible. She gestured toward the greenhouse dome visible through the windows. Like the orchids that inspired our work, we have adapted to challenging conditions and found ways to thrive. But unlike those solitary blooms, we have done so by recognizing that our greatest strength lies in connection across disciplines, across traditions, across the boundaries that too often separate those who suffer from those who seek to heal. As applause filled the room, Sophia caught Julian's eye across the crowd. In that moment of shared understanding, they both recognized that what had begun as an encounter between worlds had blossomed into something that transcended them both, proof that true beauty wasn't found in external trappings but in the courage to create something authentic, in a world of artificial distinctions. Outside, as twilight settled over the institute, the orchids in their carefully tended environments continued their silent work of adaptation and resilience. Nature's reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with a single, unexpected connection.